morning, everybody, on a very hot and humid Oklahoma morning. And in the adult Sunday school class, we have been studying Mark chapter 5. And we're continuing our study of Mark chapter 5, starting in verse 25 of Mark chapter 5, and it reads, "And a certain woman, which had an issue of blood 12 years, and had suffered many things of many physicians, and had spent all that she had, and was nothing better, but rather grew worse. And when she had heard of Jesus, came in the press behind, and touched his garment. For she said, If I may touch but his clothes, I shall be whole. And straightway the fountain of her blood was dried up, and she felt her body that she was healed of that plague. And Jesus, immediately knowing in himself that virtue had gone out of him, turned him about in the press and said, Who touched my clothes? And his disciples said to him, Thou seest the multitude thronging thee, and sayest thou, Who touched me? And he looked round about to see her that had done this thing. But the woman, fearing and trembling, knowing what was done in her, came and fell down before him, and told him all the truth. And he said to her, Daughter, thy faith hath made thee whole. Go in peace, and be whole of thy plague." Now, what a beautiful thing. The lesson writer writes, this woman was in a desperate condition. Her condition made her ceremonially and socially unclean. And this was a significant burden to live under for 12 years. Because basically, it caused, whatever issue she had was causing her to bleed out. And because she had spent all of her money, no doctor could help her. And so here she was, ceremonially unclean, unable to go to family reunions. And I'm telling you, now some of us nowadays would probably be happy if I couldn't go. Have that excuse. I'm sorry, I can't go, his family. But the truth is, she was isolated and pushed out from society. So here she is desperate. She heard all about Jesus and all the healing. Now, she looks out, there's this huge crowd. She knows she's not going to even be able to get in front of him. She's not going to be able to, touch, get close enough to be able to even have a conversation with him. So she thinks to herself, if I could just touch his garment, I will be clean. According to the Jewish ideas of the time, if this woman touched anyone, she made him or her ceremonially unclean. This uncleanness did not allow them to take part in any aspect of Israel's worship. She wouldn't even be able to go to church, go to a synagogue. She wouldn't be able to, take part in the Passover or any celebrations. She was completely isolated. By the very law of her people, she was divorced from her husband and could not live in her own home. She was ostracized from all society and must not come into contact with any of her old friends. She was excommunicated from the services of the synagogue and thus shut out from woman's court in the temple. She went to the doctors to get better, but only suffered worse and became poor. Luke the physician also tells us that she had spent all of her livelihood on physicians, as is written in Luke chapter 8:43. He knew how doctor bills could take all the money a family had. Even in those days, that people spent everything to be cured. And if you think about it, how many times have you gone to a doctor and they had no idea what was wrong with you? I remember when I was before I got diagnosed with migraines, it's like I went to a neurologist, I went to this person. It felt like I was a human, guinea pig. There's different treatments. I had one medicine that I took called neurotriptyline that halfway through the day I forgot where I was. I'm like, I'm not taking this again. I said, I don't care. I'll take the migraine because I know what it is versus this medicine. And, when you go through suffer and all your money keeps going to all this medicine. And think about in those days, they didn't have insurance. It's literally, she spent everything she had to try to get better, and she was numb, and she never did. The ancient rabbis had many different formulas to help when a woman afflicted like this. Now, this is their medicine. Rabbi Jochanan, I'll never be able to pronounce some of these people's names. It's like, oh, seriously. Take the gum of Alexandria, of alum, and of a Quercus hortensis, which is a flower, the weight of a zuzi each. Let them be bruised together and given in wine to the woman that hath an issue of blood. But if this fail, take out Persian onions, 9 logs, boil them in wine, and give it to her to drink, and say, arise from thy flux. But if should this fail, set her in a place where 2 ways meet, and let her hold a cup of wine in her hand, and let somebody come and affright her and say, arise from thy flux. But this didn't do any good. So, be in the middle of the street holding a cup of wine, and someone come up and go, whoa, and scare you. You're cured. Can you imagine? It's silly for us to think about this. Just think just a few hundred years ago, when someone was really sick, they believed that an illness was in the blood. So they'd bleed you out. He's getting paler. Take more blood. And a lot of people ended up dying because, they didn't understand bacteria or viruses. They thought it was just they bled them out, things would get better. It didn't. I was watching last night in 1948 in Iran, a man was bitten by a rabid wolf, and they had like a video. They did a documentary of him progressing. Of course, now, if someone does contract rabies, there's very little that can be done because it is, almost 99.9% fatal. But we have different methodologies. So their methodology was, here's some more water. and of course, obviously he would contract. And here, of course, at the late final stages, here he is, he's moaning, he's groaning. Of course, there's thankfully no audio, but you see him moaning and groaning, his eyes rolling, and there's saliva. And here are these doctors with their bare hands wiping the saliva away, And they said that it wasn't until just a few years later that people realized that, you got to, for better hygiene, even though there were doctors using gloves and things that we would think common sense nowadays, they didn't know. They just think, here they are, not thinking that they could be exposing themselves. I mean, if there's a cut or something, it would have to be not just being on the skin, it has to be good to the blood. But still, it's like, I wouldn't be touching somebody's rabid mouth. It's like one little bite. And then you have to get the shots. But of course, where he lived, they didn't have access to those shots. And so, it was unfortunate. But it was like things that we take for granted now, even just a few years ago, 30, 40 years ago, people weren't doing. But I could imagine how just, do musical chairs to get a cure. That's what it sounds like to me. Just dance this way, boom, you're cured. No. But the fact is, nothing she had tried, and she spent money on this. Think about it. She spent money on this, doing the hokey pokey. It didn't make a difference. When the soul is sick today, they often go to different doctors and spend a great deal of time and money, only to suffer many things from many physicians. A sick soul may go to Dr. Entertainment, but find no cure. They may pay a visit to Dr. Success, but he is no help in the long run. Dr. Pleasure, Dr. Self-Help, or Dr. Religion can't bring a cure. Only Dr. Jesus can. I thought that's almost a sermon in itself. I thought, what a beautiful thing to write. Because this woman's condition was embarrassing, and because she was ceremonially unclean and would be condemned for touching Jesus or even being in a pressing crowd, she wanted to do this secretly. She would not openly ask Jesus to be healed, but she thought, if I only may touch his clothes, I shall be made well. Since we have no evidence in the Bible that Jesus healed this way before, it seems that the woman acted at least partially on superstition. Her faith had elements of error and superstition, yet she did believe in the healing power of Jesus, and the border of his garment served as a point of contact for that faith. There are many things that we could find wrong with this woman's faith. Nevertheless, her faith was ultimately in Jesus, and the object of faith is more important than the quality of faith. You know what Jesus told his disciples? You have a faith the size of a grain of mustard seed. Not perfect faith. Perfect faith, there's no doubt. You just, hey, mountain get moved, and you know it's going to move. But God doesn't expect perfect faith, just enough. And she just had enough faith to be healed. There was no magic in the garments of Jesus. Perhaps there was a superstition in the woman's mind, but Jesus honored her darkened faith as in the case of Peter's shadow and Paul's handkerchief. Matthew 9:20 says she touched the hem of his garment, and that actually means one of the borders of the outer garment that all Jews wore. Every devout Jew wore an outer robe with 4 tassels on it, one on each corner. These tassels were worn in obedience to the command in Numbers 15:38-40. And they were to signify to others and to remind the man himself that the wearer was a member of God's chosen people. When the Bible says, immediately the fountain of her blood was dried up, according to the thinking of the day, when this unclean woman touched Jesus, it would make him unclean. But because of the nature of Jesus and the power of God, that wasn't how it worked. When she touched his garment, Jesus wasn't made unclean. The woman was made whole. When we come to Jesus with our sin and lay it upon him, it doesn't make him a sinner, but it makes us clean. How about that again? That's so beautiful. She felt in her body that she was healed of her affliction, immediately knowing in himself that power had gone out of him. When the woman was healed, both the woman and Jesus knew it happened. She felt in her body that it happened, and Jesus felt power had gone out of him. It would be interesting to know what power had gone out of him. What does it mean? This is the only healing or miracle in the ministry of Jesus or any else in the Bible that mentions this idea. From every other healing in the ministry of Jesus, we don't get the idea that God's healing power was communicated by a noticeable surge of power flowing through Jesus and into someone else. Yet on this occasion, something like that happened, even if we don't know how. Who touched my clothes? Robertson says that Jesus more literally said, who touched me on my clothes? Her goal wasn't to touch the clothes of Jesus, but to touch Jesus. The clothes just happened to be a part of Jesus, of the part of Jesus that she could touch. Because this woman was embarrassed and thought her uncleanness meant no one would let her touch Jesus, she tried to do it secretly. But God often brings his work out into the open, even if it may start secretly. When speaking about that, he looked around to see who had done this thing. This was before she revealed herself. Now, Jesus knew all along who exactly touched him and received the healing. He asked who touched my clothes for the benefit of the woman, not because he didn't know who she was. The disciples were amazed that Jesus asked this question. Given the situation, his disciples said to him, you see the multitude thronging you, and you say, who touched me? Everybody's touching you. But the disciples didn't understand the difference between casual contact with Jesus and reaching out to him in faith. We can imagine someone, because of the press of the crowd, bumped up against Jesus. When the woman's miracle was revealed, they might say, I bumped into Jesus and touched him, yet I was not healed. But there is a huge difference between bumping into Jesus here and there and reaching out to touch him in faith. You can come to a church week after week and bump into Jesus. That isn't the same as reaching out to touch him in faith. That's like, people coming to church week after week after week, but receiving nothing. They're not looking for something. They're there just to be there versus reaching out. And that's what they're pointing out, that lots of people bumped into him, but only she was reaching out in faith. She had a need and she knew Jesus could take care of it. And Jesus did. Spurgeon would write, it's not every contact with Christ that saves men. It is the arousing of yourself to come near to him. The determinate, the personal, the resolute, believing touch of believing touch of Jesus Christ which saves. That is, the belief that Jesus can save. Augustine long ago said of this story, flesh presses, but faith touches. He can always distinguish between the jostle of a curious mob and the agonized touch of a needy soul. I thought, what a beautiful statement. You know, there is a song we sing, well, there's a song that David used to sing in church. And I'm sure it's somewhere in the midst there, probably in an unmarked case, but it's called He Touched Me. I'm going to have to find it now. I don't know if it probably doesn't even have the words to it, but I'll find it and see if I can sing it. It's such a beautiful song, He Touched Me. You know, and that's a thing to be touched by Christ, but for a person to be touched by Christ, you just can't accidentally bump into Christ. It's a seeking. You have to seek, and that's, of course, part of what my message is going to be about today. So that concludes today's lesson. We'll find out exactly more about what happened with this woman in their next lesson. Because it is either do one halfway long lesson or do a very, very long lesson because it really doesn't come to a stopping point. It just goes on. I thought, well, I got to make a stopping point or people start throwing rocks at me.